Hello, Preet, can you hear me? Okay, so Preet, can you hear me? Okay, perfect. Let's get started. Okay, so let me give you a little bit of an overview what we did in the last class on Saturday, and then we'll move forward from there. So we started off with the fourth and the final type of market structure, which is oligopoly, right? So we said that it's a little more complicated, which we'll see today, right? Because there are a few aspects of oligopoly which are not present in other markets. But obviously, we'll talk about all of those today. So what is oligopoly? So oligopoly market is a market where there are few firms which have relatively high market share. And why there are few firms? Because these markets generally have a complicated product or an expensive product, which means that, there's a lot of investment that's involved in producing that product, right? So markets where the product is complicated or expensive to produce, and therefore there are few firms, right? There are few large firms only. Okay. Now, what type of markets will be considered as oligopoly? Telecommunication industry, right? So in every country, there are almost 4 or 5 companies that provide telecommunication services. Similarly, if we think of airline industry, right? Every country at max has, 3, 4 airline firms, right? Then there are few firms in the world for oil and gas and so on and so forth, right? So all these markets will be classified as oligopoly. Now, coming to the characteristics, we said first characteristics, we have already discussed that there are few firms with high market share. That's the first characteristic. Second is that there are relatively high entry barriers in terms of producing a technologically complicated product and the amount of investment needed to set up the operations. So why are the entry barriers high? Because firstly, there's high investment requirement, and the product is also technologically complicated, and therefore not a lot of firms can produce it. So if you think about all the telecommunication firms, I mean, you need to have set up all the infrastructure, which includes the signal towers and all the technology needed to ensure that the signals are available. Similarly, if you think of airline industry, it's even more complicated, right? Oil and gas requires huge amount of investment, the machines and all the space that you need to explore, or like extract oil and then to refine oil. It's done in big refineries and factories, right? So that's why entry barriers are high. Then most of the time, the nature of the good produced by the firm in oligopoly markets is homogeneous. How do we know this? Because if you compare the oil that you can find on different producers, like different retailers, the composition of petrol is the same across the globe. The composition of diesel is same across the globe, right? So if the nature of the good is homogeneous, then comes in the fourth point. There is price rigidity, which prevents a single firm to change the product price, right? So one single firm, and this is the next thing that we'll discuss in detail, that one single firm in oligopoly is not capable of increasing or decreasing the price. That's why prices are rigid. They're not very flexible. They don't fluctuate a lot, or they can't change very frequently. Prices are rigid. And then to overcome the problem of price rigidity, the firms in oligopoly markets are very likely to form a collusion. And we'll talk more about what collusion means in today's class, right? So let's get started on this. Let's get started, right? Now, first thing that we have to understand is that what is this element of price rigidity, right? So in the case of price rigidity, let's first have a look at the demand curve for a firm in oligopoly, right? So what I'm about to make here is the demand curve for a firm in oligopoly market, right? So standard things apply. So you will have the same things on the y-axis. So since we are only making the demand curve at the moment, so I'll only write price on the y-axis, and I'll write the output of the good produced on the x-axis, right? Now, the shape of the demand curve in oligopoly market is known as, I'll tell you, kinked demand curve, right? So it's known as kinked demand curve, and the way it looks like is like this, right? So think about this. Now, if you compare this demand curve with other demand curves in other market structures, right? So it's nowhere close to what you see in other market structures, right? Demand curve in oligopoly markets. And I'll explain you why the shape of the demand curve is like that. Demand curve in oligopoly markets, right? Now, this is known as kinked demand curve, right? It's known as kinked demand curve. Okay. Now, if you look at the shape carefully, now what is happening over here, right? Or I could have made it like this. Just give me a second, right? So it would be less steep on top, right? And then it becomes more steep in the second half, right? So there basically there's a bend. So there's a kink, there's a bend in the demand curve, right? Now have a look at this. Now I'll tell you what this bend in the demand curve signifies. Okay, have a look at this. Now let's assume this price is P1. And we did talk about that the prices in oligopoly markets will be rigid. Now, what is the significance of this kink, this bend, right? So if an oligopoly firms tries to increase price, then what will be the problem? And similarly, if a firm in oligopoly market wants to reduce price, then what will be the problem? That is what we're about to discuss, right? Because we already know that the prices will be rigid around this level. So first thing that you have to understand that what's the name of this curve, right? So this special shape of demand curve in oligopoly markets is known as kinked demand curve. And how does it look like? So it's less steep on the first half, and then there's a bend, and then it becomes more steep, right? Does it make sense? Is this clear? Breathe. Okay. Now, I said that the prices will be rigid around this level. So where there's bend in the demand curve, prices will be rigid around this level. This means that it will be hard for any single firm in oligopoly to move price apart from P1. Now, when we say move price, so either the option would be to increase price or to decrease price. And in either case, what's the problem? That's what we're about to discuss. Now, let's assume first option is that the firm wants to increase its price. Okay, fair enough, not a problem. Now, let's talk about some specific examples. So there is PSO and there's Shell, right? So I did tell you that PSO stands for Pakistan State Oil, and Shell is an international multinational company, which I'm sure is present in a lot of different countries of the world. Okay. Now, since the oil composition sold by PSO and Shell is the same, because petrol is a chemical which has the same composition across the globe chemically, right? Yeah, I can totally agree that there can be some difference in the services. So perhaps Shell petrol pumps provide a better service, their customers service is better compared to PSO or vice versa, but whatever, right? But the main product that they both sell is exactly the same. Now, let's say usually the prices of petrol is fixed by the government in every country, but I mean, I'll give you some other examples as well. So let's say if Shell is selling each liter of petrol in Pakistan for 110 liters, though it's not the case right now, the prices have really increased. And let's say PSO is selling for 112 rupees. Now, there's hardly any difference, yes or no? I mean, 2 rupees per liter is not that much of a difference, right? In Pakistani currency. But still, do you think that people will prefer Shell over PSO only because of the fact that it's 2 rupees per liter cheaper compared to what the PSO is selling? What do you think? Right? Would people have a preference to go to Shell because their petrol is cheaper compared to what PSO is selling? Do you agree with me? Right? So the answer to that is yes. Why? Simply because of the fact that the main product is cheaper. And why? If in case the brand would have been different or the product quality would have been different, then yes, we would have said that, price is compensated because of the fact that one company is providing a better quality product compared to the other firm. But in this case, since I've already told you that product quality is homogeneous, right? So products are homogeneous, which means that there's absolutely no difference. They're very similar. So therefore, people will only choose a company on the basis of the price that it's selling the good for, right? Right, I'll write everything down on the notes. Don't worry about it. Okay. Now, let me give you another example. So two telecommunication firms, right, in Pakistan let me write down the names, right? Because we said that telecommunication industry is also similar to oligopoly. That's also an oligopoly market, telecommunication, right? So one is Jazz. So there are a total of basically 4 companies, if I write. Let me write down the names of all those, right? So there's Jazz, there's Uphone, right? Then you have Zong, which is basically a Chinese company, right? And then we have Telenor. Okay. Now, these are the 4 companies that are operating in the telecommunication industry of Pakistan. Now, think about this. The services are very similar in terms of the 4G, 5G, not 5G yet, right? But the 3G and 4G services of internet that they provide, like even in terms of network coverage. I mean, pretty much each of the four firms has same area coverage in Pakistan and so on and so forth, right? Now, the basis on which people will choose the service provider would be on the basis of how much is the price, right? So if for a certain amount of calls and a certain number of messages and so on and so forth, right? So let's assume that Jazz is the cheapest, right? So what will that do in the market? So that will make Telenor customers, right, Zong customers and Ufone customers switch to, right? Not all, because some people also value some other things more than the price, but then still there is high chance that people will switch to Jazz. Is this making sense? Preet? So this being said, what I'm trying to emphasize over here, that if one company in oligopoly market, like if one company alone is increasing the price of its products, then the risk involved in that strategy is that its competitors, that firm's competitors, will not follow what the other firms, will not, the competitors of that firm will not increase the price, and therefore this firm will lose its customers to its competitors, right? So that's the first challenge involved if you're increasing the price. On the other hand, if you're reducing the price, then why is that a problem, right? So I'll tell you why even reducing a price in oligopoly market is a challenge, is a problem, right? And the reason, better speed, then people can pay a higher price. Exactly, that's correct, right? But the very assumption that we made, right? So in telecommunication industry, I do understand that there can be differences, there can be some major differences when it comes to quality and when it comes to speed and when it comes to reliability of the service. You're very right? But that's why I said that a better example of oligopoly would be oil and gas, right? Because I mean, gas and oil composition is the same, right? And therefore people are mainly choosing a firm only on the basis of how much price it has to offer. Are you getting me, right? So that's another thing. Okay, now is this making sense? Right, is this making sense? Okay, now moving forward from here, right? So right, perfect. Now, why is reducing price a challenge? Why is reducing price a challenge, right? Let me explain you that. So if you reduce your price, right? If you reduce the price of your product, right? Just give me a second. Okay, so if you're reducing your price in an oligopoly market, the problem here is that other firms would also reduce their price. Why? Because they don't want to lose their customers to you. Other firms will also reduce price to stay competitive. Yes or no? Reduce prices to stay competitive. Okay, now that's perfectly fine. But then what happens? Now you have to understand this. When you are reducing price and your competitors are also reducing price, then at the end of the day, it is hurting both of you. I repeat, right? So think about Shell and PSO, right? So if let's say one of the two companies decide to reduce price to attract more customers, okay, that's a good enough strategy, perhaps. But then Shell can also do the same. Why? Because obviously Shell doesn't want to lose its customer to PSO. Right? So if PSO was the first one to reduce price, right, it's very likely that Shell will follow PSO. Why? Because Shell doesn't want to lose its customers to PSO. Now, when that happens, at the end of the day, the price for both the businesses, right, both the firms have reduced the prices of their products, and eventually it will hurt what? Eventually it will hurt their profits. So the profits of the two companies would go down because of lower prices. Do you agree with me? Right? And there is a word that we use for this in oligopoly, and that is known as price wars. So when one company is reducing the price and the other company, its competitor, is also reducing the price to stay competitive, at the end of the day, the prices, there is a cycle that goes on and builds on, that both companies start reducing prices and eventually it harms their profit. So in short, reducing the price is also not an option in oligopoly. Therefore, what happens? The prices stay stuck at this level. That is that concept that I was explaining, that I told you I'll explain, which is known as price rigidity. So that's why we say that in oligopoly markets, when prices are rigid around this level, this is known as price rigidity, right? Any confusion so far, right? Right? So that's the first point that we have discussed in oligopoly markets, that what price rigidity is and how does it look like in real life, right? Now let's write this down over here. Okay, so price rigidity is when single firm in oligopoly cannot increase or decrease price, therefore prices stay constant at the level. Okay, now we're about to explain that how or why does this happen. If firm its price, then there is a high chance that other firms not increase their price. As the result, first customers are quite likely to switch competitors in search of from prices. Does it make sense, right? So think about this. What I said so far, price rigidity is when a single firm in an oligopoly market cannot increase or decrease price, and therefore prices stay constant at the initial level. Now, what's the reason for that? If, for example, a firm raises its price, then there is a high chance that other firms would not increase their price, and as the result, the first firm's customers are likely to switch to its competitors to benefit from lower prices, right? So that's the reason why increasing price is a challenge in oligopoly market. Then on the other hand, if you reduce price, as we just discussed, right, then other firms will also stay competitive, and therefore there is a chance of price war, where all firms make lower profits, right? Now think about this. Now, similarly, why would you not be able to even reduce price? Because if you do that, other firms will also follow you. Why? Because obviously they have to stay competitive. They also want to, they also don't want to lose their market share to you. So if they're also reducing prices, you're also reducing prices, then at the end, what happens? Due to lower prices, both companies' profits will be affected. Now, what's the solution for this? Now, this is a very important point. Now, what's the solution to this, right? Now, this is what brings us to the next, this is what brings us to the next topic that we're about to discuss, and that is collusion, right? Now, the solution to price rigidity is collusion, right? Now, what is collusion? I'll explain you in detail. Now, you have to understand this. Have you ever heard the word cartel? Preet, have you ever heard the word cartel? Cartel, C-A-R-T-E-L. Now, what is collusion? Collusion is basically when, right? No, okay, let me explain you in detail, right? Collusion is when a firm, when number of firms come together to act as a single producer by mutually deciding their prices and output. Now, let me explain you in simple words what cartel is. Now, think about this. So cartel or collusion, I mean, these are quite similar to each other, although there's a slight difference, which I'll explain you in a bit, right? But let's first try to understand what collusion is. So in movies, they often use the word drug cartel, right? Or oil cartel or oil mafia, right? So mafia is more slang. I mean, mafia is more associated with gang and something of the sort or something illegal, right? But collusion is a proper economic term. Cartel is also an economic term. Now, what collusion basically means? Now, think about this. So let's say there are 5 firms in any market, right? So if these 5 firms, right? Otherwise, what happens in any market, right? So these are competitors, but what they do in normal markets, I'm explaining you, right? So in normal markets, so these 5 firms are competing against each other because they're producing the same product, right? And the entire market would be divided into these 5 firms, right? So some firms can have higher market share, other firms can have lower market share. So let's say this company has 10% share, this company has 20% market share, this company has 30% market share. So that makes 50 and 60, and the remaining two 60, and then this company has, let's say, 30, and the last one also has 10%, right? Now, this is usually, or any other distribution would exist, right, between different firms. So market is split between the 5 firms that produce that. But what happens in cartel, that all these 5 firms decide to not compete with each other and instead form an agreement in which, through which they decide that they will collectively set their prices so that technically the competition is eliminated. Every firm gets to maintain the same market share that they have. But if all firms are collectively increasing their prices, Preet, right? So it's not that the A's market share would increase, because all companies are, let's say, collectively increasing their prices by 5%, let's assume, right? So since they have formed this agreement, which is known as collusion, and during through that agreement, collusion or cartel, they have all decided to increase their prices collectively by 5%. So the market share between them stay the same. So their customers have no reason to switch between each other. Why so? Because think about this. If I'm a customer of A, and now I see that, A has increased its price by 5%, then I would not even want to switch to B. Why? Because even B's price is 5% higher than before, and similarly, so on and so forth. So what actually happens is that I will stick with A, but now since I'm paying a higher price for each product, A's profit is higher than what it used to be before. Did you get my point? So collusion is basically when number of firms come together to form an agreement so to act as a single producer by mutually deciding their prices and output. So basically through cartel, they become what? They become a monopoly. Because what is a monopoly? Monopoly is a single firm with all the market share. Obviously, there's really a single firm or one dominant firm in the market. So it's not exactly monopoly, but they're getting monopoly powers. What are monopoly powers? Monopoly power is when one dominant firm or one big firm gets to, right? When big firm or one dominant firm gets to, control the market prices and things like that. So with a collusion agreement, these firms in oligopoly markets are able to mutually decide what their prices should be and how much the output should each firm produce, right? So that is collusion. Another thing we need to add over here is always illegal, and therefore every effort to ensure that regulatory bodies not find about their agreement. Okay, now think about this. So Preet, let's try to sum this up. So what I just said was that in collusion, what happens? So collusion or cartel is another word, right? Collusion is when number of firms in a market come together to act as a single producer. Now, what they do actually, is that they form an agreement. So these, all the four or five or whatever the number of companies might be, they come together, their top management, the owners or whoever, right, or their shareholders, right, and then they decide that we will form an agreement, and through that agreement, we all of us will collectively increase the prices so that it's the consumer who's paying the higher prices, and as the result, we all are making more profit out of that. So that is what the collusion is. And then, as I said, that collusion is always illegal, and therefore companies will make all possible effort to make sure that this cartel agreement or the collusion agreement is not, the government regulatory bodies which are there to make sure that companies are fairly competing with each other, they do not get to find out about this collusion. Now think about this. In every country, before we move on, in Pakistan, we have Competition Commission of Pakistan. And this is not only in Pakistan, I'm sure there would be something similar in India. There's Competition Commission, UK, right? Now, what is the purpose of this government-owned institution, right? So the purpose of this government-owned institution is to make sure that all firms in the market are competing fairly, right? So there's competition between them, right? And there is no, as such, any illegal activity taking place. As I said, that collusion is always illegal. Now, what these firms do, that is what we're about to discuss next. So basically, there are two types of collusion agreements, right? Which I'm about to write over here, right? Types of collusion agreements, right? Now, there are two types of collusion agreement, as I said, and I'm about to list both over here. So the first one is known as price leadership, right? And another one is known as cartel. Okay. Now, there is a difference between, there's another word that we use for it. So let me write that down as well. Implicit collusion, right? And cartel is known as explicit collusion. Then I'll also give you some real life examples of these things. Okay, now think about this. So there are two types of collusion agreements. So collusion is basically the idea of different firms, companies coming together and acting as a single producer, where they get to set their prices and they get to set their output. Now that's what we need to know about collusion. Now the second thing is that collusion can happen in two possible ways. One is price leadership, right? Which is also known as implicit collusion, as I've written over here. The second type is known as cartel, which is also known as explicit collusion. Now, with the price leadership, the thing is, the firms that compete selected leader, and their whatever price platform charges, other firms follow. Okay. Now, what happens in price leadership? Let's first discuss this one. So in price leadership, which is also known as implicit. Now, what is implicit? Let me tell you. So there's difference between explicit and implicit. Explicit and implicit are, simply speaking, English words. Explicit means out in the open. So if I say I explicitly told him, right, that he doesn't look good, this means that I told him right in front of his face that he doesn't look good, right? That is explicit. Implicit means, I mean, in hidden words, or something under the cover, not out in the open, right? Now, and that is the difference between the two. So price leadership is not out in the open. Not everyone knows it, right? So what they do, as I was saying, that in collusion agreement, companies make sure that their collusion agreement is not known to the government. And for that, what they do, they select a leader amongst them. So out of 5 companies, let's say, this is how it happens. So out of 5 companies that are part of this collusion, let's say company B is selected to be the leader. Now, whatever price the company B would charge, other firms will follow, right? So company B, let's say, increases the price by 5%, right? Then all of the firms will also increase the price of their products by 5%. If company B increases its price by 2%, then all of the companies will follow and increase their price by 2%, right? So there's one leader who is making the price change and other companies are just following. Now, this is something that is hard for the government to detect, because obviously there's no strong evidence that these companies have formed a collusion. Are you getting me? In price leadership, it's difficult for regulatory bodies to identify, right? Is it making sense? Preet, is everything clear so far? Right? I know all of these things are completely new to you, but if there is any confusion, anything that's not making sense, or if anything is difficult to comprehend, kindly let me know, right? So does it make sense? So what is the benefit of price leadership? That it's hard for the regulatory bodies to identify or to, tag that as collusion. Why? Because there's no evidence as such, right? Now, moving towards cartel or explicit collusion, in this, things are very different. Explicit meaning out in the open, right? Now, cartel or explicit collusion is when there is publicly known agreement between the companies that they will right. Explicit collusion is when there is a publicly known agreement between the companies that they will set their prices, that they will collectively, right? So they will collectively set their prices and output, right? Now, in cartel, it's different from price leadership because there is already publicly known agreement, right? And I mean, they don't mind telling regulatory bodies or anyone else that they have a cartel agreement formed between them. Now, one such example in the world that we see of a cartel, let me tell you, right? And that is known as OECD. So what is OECD? Organization of OECD, no, not OECD, Organization Economic Cooperation Development, no. There's OPEC, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Yeah. So let me just show you, right? Now, what does OPEC stands for? OPEC stands for Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And basically, it's a cartel where number of countries which are big oil producers in the world have formed this cartel, and they collectively set their prices. And they even determine how much output will each country produce, right? Have a look at this. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries is an intergovernmental organization or cartel of 13 countries founded on Baghdad, blah, 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 right? So these are the 14 countries, I guess, right? So if you just write OPEC members, right? So all the big producers, all the big oil producing countries have formed this cartel through which they get to set their prices and output. And that's why when we often see that world oil prices are fluctuating a lot and things like that, that is mainly because of, OPEC countries, right? So it includes Algeria, Angola, Congo, Ecuador, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Libya, Nigeria, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and UAE and Venezuela, right? So this is basically what a cartel is, right? Now, this cartel exists at the world level. And as I said, even though it's illegal, but you can't really help it, right? So within a country, controlling a cartel is not a problem, because if a cartel exists in, let's say, auto industry in Pakistan, then the government is the supreme authority. The Competition Commission of Pakistan will take definitely some sort of action against them. But when the cartel is on a country level, right, there are 15 different countries that are involved, and they are producing such a major product like oil, which can technically halt the entire world economy. Then even the big international organizations like World Bank and IMF and United Nations are kind of helpless in front of them, right? Does it make sense? So that is basically what a cartel is. Now, coming back and summing all of our discussion up. So we said that what are the characteristics? Let's quickly discuss. So oligopoly is a market where there are few firms with high market share, right? Now, what type of markets will qualify as oligopoly? Oil industry, I said telecommunication industry, and airline industry, right? Okay. Now, why there are few firms? Because either the product is technologically complicated to produce, right? Which means that not a lot of firms would be able to acquire that technical knowledge, right? Or secondly, because there is high investment requirement, because of which not a lot of firms can enter the market. Now, there are few firms with high market share. There are relatively high entry barriers, as I just explained, either because the product is complicated to produce or because the investment requirement is high. Then the nature of the good is most of the times homogeneous, not always, right? There can be difference in services between different producers, but more or less the nature of the good is homogeneous. Then two more very important characteristics of oligopoly. The first one, that there is price rigidity. What is price rigidity? That no single firm can increase or decrease the price, right? And then to overcome the problem of price rigidity, it's very likely that the firms in oligopoly will form a collusion. Now, first explaining the concept of price rigidity very quickly. So we discussed that the shape of the demand curve in oligopoly market is kinked, right? Now, what is kinked demand curve? So kinked demand curve looks like this, right? Where it is less steep on top, which means it's more elastic on top, on the first half, and then there is a bend in the demand curve, and then it becomes more steep, right? So this is known as kinked demand curve. Where there's a bend in the demand curve, that is basically where the prices are rigid. That point is where the prices are rigid, right? Now, why are prices rigid around this level? Now, this is without collusion. Preet, are you getting me? So price rigidity does exist in oligopoly, but that is when collusion doesn't exist. Because after collusion, we have just seen that with collusion, you can do anything. You can increase price. Obviously, you will never reduce price, because why would you want to reduce your profits? Why would companies want to reduce their profits? But after collusion, price rigidity doesn't exist anymore. So price rigidity exists before collusion has been formed. This is making sense, Preet? This is clear, right? So before collusion, let's say if there's no collusion between firms in oligopoly, then what happens, that there will be price rigidity. You have normally, obviously, any company has only two options, either to increase the price of their products or to reduce the price of their products. Now, if they increase the price, the fear is that the other firms will not increase their price, and therefore you'll lose your customers to your competitors, which you don't want. In the second case, if you are reducing your price, right, then your competitors will also reduce the price. And at the end of the day, it can either result in price wars, which means that both of you are constantly, in the, both the companies or more companies perhaps are constantly trying to reduce their price and price to attract more customers. But in the process, companies are harming themselves, because lower profits would result as the result of lower prices, right? So you technically have no option, and the prices stay rigid around this level. Now, then we said that to overcome this problem, firms form a cartel or a collusion. So collusion is basically an agreement between number of firms in which they collectively decide their prices and their output, right? Now, there are two types of, and collusion is always illegal, by the way. Collusion is always illegal, right? Now, what are the two options of forming a collusion? One is price leadership or implicit collusion. So in that, what you do, out of all the firms in the market, one firm is selected to be the leader, and whatever price increase that firm is undertaking, other firms will also follow that. That's what price leadership means. One firm is the leader, that company gets to decide how much to increase the price, and other companies just follow that, right? Now, the good thing about price leadership for these companies is that it's hard for the regulatory bodies to detect and to prove that it's really a cartel, right? The other way of going around this is forming simply a cartel or a collusion, a cartel or an explicit collusion. Explicit is because it means out in the open, right? So explicit collusion is when there is an agreement formed between all the different firms in the market, and everyone knows about it. But and through that agreement, they decide how much will be the prices, how much will be the output, right? And as I said, that within a country, forming a cartel is really, kind of next to impossible. Why? Because then the regulatory bodies in every country, like Competition Commission of Pakistan, and in other countries, there will be a different company, right? They get to stop that. But if a cartel is taking place at the world level, as I just explained you, right? OPEC, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, I mean, it's really difficult and next to impossible to control that. Okay, now if we have completed this, then we'll quickly move on and look at the graph for oligopoly, right? Now, how the graph for oligopoly looks like, that's what we're about to discuss next, right? So first of all, obviously you'll draw a simple graph like this and you will label the axes, right? So on the y-axis, as always in market structure graphs, as we have seen, you will have the price and the cost, right? So you will write price slash cost on the y-axis, and on the x-axis you have the output, right? Then the next thing that you have to draw on the graph is your kinked demand curve, right? Now, what's the shape of the kinked demand curve? So it is less steep on top, and then it becomes more steep later, right? So there's a kink in the demand curve, right? Okay, now this being said, then the next thing that you need to draw, and this is very important, have a look at this. The next thing that you have to draw is your marginal revenue. So this demand curve that I've drawn, obviously demand curve always shows you what? So this is your D, which is your demand. It shows you the price, how much is the price for each one of the good that you're selling. And this also shows you the AR, which is your average revenue. Now to the left of that would lie your marginal revenue, like always. But there's a slight difference in the marginal revenue for the oligopoly market. Now let me show you how that will look like, right? So the marginal revenue for oligopoly looks like this. Now this is a very weird looking graph, but let me explain you what this shows, right? Okay, have a look at this. So the marginal revenue for oligopoly market looks like this. So initially it comes as a straight line and it's to the left of the demand curve, just like any other marginal revenue. So it comes straight up till the part where there's a kink, in the demand curve. So your marginal revenue comes straight down to the left of it, right? And it goes straight down till the part where there's a kink. Then what happens, there is a discontinuity. There's a discontinuity in the marginal revenue. Why is that so? I'll tell you in a bit, right? And then it resumes beyond a certain point, right? So let's look at this marginal revenue curve one more time. So your marginal revenue curve in oligopoly market would come as a straight downward sloping line till there's a kink, right? I'm just trying to make a straight line, right? So there's a kink. So it comes straight down still there till there is a kink, right? Then there's a discontinuity in the marginal revenue curve, right? And then it resumes like this, and then it resumes like this, right? So that is the shape of the marginal revenue. Okay, now as far as the cost curves are concerned, we know that cost curves in any market would always be the same, right? So this is your marginal revenue. The cost curve in any market structure are always the same, right? Absolutely no difference, right? So let's first draw the marginal revenue. So marginal revenue would look like this, J-shaped curve as always. And then the last of all is your ATC, right? So your ATC is also U-shaped graph, and it would look like the same in the oligopoly markets as well, right? Does it make sense? Okay. Now, just to quickly show you, right? So can you see? Let me draw. Okay. So there is red, right? So that's the shape of your, it's taking some time to load, right? So that's the shape of your oligopoly market curve. Okay, now coming back to where we were, right? Okay, now think about this. What is the point of profit maximization, Preet? What's the output level at which any firm will maximize its profit, right? At what point would a firm maximize its profit, right? So the firm maximizes profit where the marginal revenue is equals to marginal cost. Excellent, right? Have a look at this. Now, this is your marginal cost, which is green line, and this is your marginal revenue curve, which is the pink curve, right? Now, the two are intersecting at this point, right? Now, what you're supposed to do, as I've always told you, that you see where the two lines are intersecting, you bring that dotted line and you connect it to the y-axis and you label it as QP. You label it as QP, which is the profit maximization quantity. Then you take this dotted line up, and connect it with the, then you take this dotted line up and you connect it to the y-axis, right? And you'll see that it will connect with the y-axis at the point where there's a bend, where there's a kink, right? So this is the price per unit that the oligopoly market is charging. And then you also see that where is this dotted line intersecting with your ATC, so that you can find out how much is the average total cost of producing the good, right? So this is the level at which ATC1 or whatever, right? This is the cost of producing a typical unit of the good. And therefore the difference between the price and the ATC is your per unit profit times QP. So the area of this shaded region, which is basically more of a rectangle, right? So this would show what? The abnormal profit. This will show the abnormal or the supernormal profit that each firm in oligopoly earns, right? Is this simple? Is this clear? So that is how the graph for oligopoly market would look like. Let's look at this one more time. So after making the graph, what's the next thing that you're supposed to do? So you're supposed to identify the profit maximization quantity. So where the marginal cost of the firm equals marginal revenue, which is this, right? So you bring that dotted line down and you label it as QP, profit maximization quantity. Next thing you are supposed to do is to take this dotted line or to extend this dotted line straight up to where it touches with the demand curve. Then you connect it horizontally with your y-axis, right? And that will tell you the price of each unit of the good, right? So you're selling each unit of the good for, let's say, whatever price, right? And then you see that where's this dotted line intersecting with your ATC, and that will be the average total cost of producing the good, right? And then the area of this region, basically, the area of this rectangle would be the abnormal profit that the oligopoly would earn, right? Okay, now is there a difference between the short run and the long run? And the answer to that is no. So oligopoly graph would always look like this, and there is absolutely no difference between the short run and the long run. Why? Because as I said, that in the long run, since entry barriers for markets where entry barriers are high, it's difficult for the new firms to enter. So when new firms would not be able to enter, the entry barriers, since entry barriers are high, therefore the oligopoly market continues to earn supernormal or abnormal profit both in the short run and in the long run, right? So this is the graph for oligopoly market both in the short and the long run, right? Is this simple, easy? Any confusion so far? We good? Breathe. Any confusion, right? So tomorrow, what we are about to do, Preet, let me give you a little bit of an idea. So tomorrow, at least for one class, I would think that, we should do some past papers related to market structures, because that's a very, very important, topic, right? And every past paper, you'll see at least, you usually see one essay question related to market structures, right? So tomorrow we'll spend one class to do some, no, there's one small topic left, and that is firm's objectives. So in firm's objectives, we'll talk about what are the different objectives that a firm, tries to achieve and all that stuff. So either we can do that first and then we can do the past paper practice, or tomorrow perhaps we can do the past paper and then come to that, right? But yeah, let's first complete the objectives first, and then we will do that, right? Is this clear? Okay, so I'll see you tomorrow. Take care and have a good night. Take care. Allah, bye. Right, so we have arranged we have already hired the business teacher, right? You must have been added to the group. You must have been added to this new WhatsApp group. Yes or no? With Sir Imad, right? Right, perfect. So I'll tell him and he'll take the demo tomorrow, right? So he was just a little busy, and he'll take the demo tomorrow and then we'll resume the classes, right? Okay, so I'll see you then. Okay, take care. Bye.